Welcome everyone to another Blender Days of Type. Today we are looking at how to transform objects. In my search for the best way to do this, I came across an effective process by Blue Fox Creations, and the link will be in the description. In their example, they used an old vehicle transforming into a new one, and it really showed the potential for animation nodes. So here is the project that we're going to create. The objects here are just two sets of cubes, but what's most important is to understand the node setup. Now, because animation nodes can be quite complex, I've always told myself that I'll get into them someday, eventually. The good thing about this node setup is that it's not overly complicated. It is straightforward and relatively easy for an animator to understand. And because of this, it is a great introduction to animation nodes as a whole. So let's get into it. So here we are in a brand new Blender file. And the first thing we need to do is create those cubes. Shift A. We'll just scale that down. Control A, apply that scale. Add a bevel. And a material. We'll just name that black. Okay. We'll snap that to the grid, front view, move it up to the floor, go to top view, and we'll just start beginning to create that cube setup. And Shift D. Front view. There we have our first set of cubes. Now, the way this works is your objects have to be in separate collections. We'll just rename this Start. Select all these cubes, press M, and move them to that Start collection. What I want now is to duplicate this collection. We'll hide the first one. We'll just rename this Finish. We will select one of these cubes. As you can see here, 250 objects are using that same material, but we want a different material in this collection. So click that button, creates a single user. We'll just rename it. Something like that. B to select all. Control L to link certain data, and in this case, materials. And now all the cubes in this Finish collection are now orange. Okay, so before we start anything, before we put down any nodes at all, what we need to do is select all the objects in both collections and create what animation nodes calls ID keys. So if we press N, this side panel will open up and the add-ons that you have active will be listed here. We'll go to animation nodes. B, select all. That's selecting the gray cubes as well. Hit new, need to name it. Let's name it transform cubes, hit OK. Now, here is that name, transform cubes, but we haven't created an ID key yet. And we want to create it from the current position of these objects. So click this button and you're set. These objects have now been associated with transform cubes and their position in 3D space has been recorded. Okay, so we can deselect them and we'll just hide the finish group for the moment. Now, in order to create the node setup, we need the animation nodes editor. Create a new one. We can name it. And we're set to begin. So the first thing we're going to do is set up a line of nodes that have to do with this first collection. And the first node that we want is a collection info node. So Shift A will give you the ability to choose any node. But in this case, we're going to object, collection info. Just another note as well. That's constantly calculating, so just need that off for the moment. And then for the node setup to change according to these parameters. So we're first dealing with this start collection. So in this drop-down box, we can choose that. So this node has collected the information regarding that collection. The next node we want is a matrix node. So object again, matrix output, and we can connect these two. So what is a matrix node? Or what is a matrix? A matrix is a set of data points, in this case in 3D space, and a matrix simply means data points set out in rows and columns. But in this case, it doesn't know what to do with them, so it's set all the objects to 0, 0, 0 in world space. So we need to get in the middle of here and control how those objects function. And the first thing we need to do is to add an ID key node. So we go to Object, ID key. And in this search field, we can choose that ID key that we set up in the beginning. Now, if we connect these matrix nodes together or inputs together, we've now told this matrix output that it's this location setting for all these cubes to be used as its matrix output. Now, that's a good start, but we need to affect the position of these cubes as they get sent to this matrix output node. And the way we do that is to create a matrix offset node. Shift A, matrix offset. And that goes right in the middle. So the way this works is that the ID key has set up the position of all these cubes. The matrix output is rendering that so we can see them. And this offset matrix is now going to control what happens to these cubes. For example, if we scale them all to 0, we can change the fall off or the amount of that scaling. This ID key has got stored the scale of these objects, and we are influencing the scale with this node, and it is being outputted to this matrix output node. Now, as an animator, we need something to affect this fall off. And we're going to do that by adding an empty. And in this case, a sphere. And we will just move that up. Somewhere in that position as we had in our first project file. So now we need to tell the node setup that it needs to recognize this sphere empty as a controller. And the way we do that is to add a Falloff object controller. So Shift A, Falloff, object controller. Plug in Falloff into Falloff. It already has it as a sphere, which is great. We need to choose that object. Now this object is now affecting these cubes. And if we click this always button and maybe get rid of snapping, you can see that it's now affecting the scale of the cubes. So in this case, as was the case of the letter B changing into the mech components, all I used was a scaling effect on this empty. So we're at frame 1. We'll press I and create a keyframe for scaling. Maybe go to frame 100. Scale that up. I, another keyframe for scaling. And there we have a basic animation. Okay, so that's the basic setup for those sets of cubes. What we want now is to duplicate these nodes, Shift D, and associate these nodes with the finish collection. So we'll turn that on. In this case, instead of start, we'll choose, that's why we need always off, because it won't allow me to select that. Select finish. Now we have a similar setup for the orange cubes. But there's no point in this example when we want to change or transform the one object into another. There's no point in both of them disappearing at the same time. As one scales down to 0, we want the other set of cubes to scale up from 0. So that means simply an invert node. Shift A, Falloff, invert. So let's run that animation again. So this node setup is responding to the scale keyframes of this empty. The first group, called start, is scaling down to 0. The finish group is scaling up to 0 at the exact same time. Okay, so a lot of the power of the animation comes from this object controller. We can change the offset and the fall off width. You can think of them as easing in and easing out. We can change them on the fly. Say -2 and 3. Now the transition is a little bit softer. We have this drop-down box that has a list of predefined Bezier curves for the animation. This back one is the one that I chose. But the only problem with that is, if we click beginning as well, the only problem with that is we don't have any real control over this, but there is a node that helps us control that. So just stop that animation. So Shift A, interpolation, construct. You basically have the same list here. We plug that in, go back, and here we can change the size of that secondary animation. And in my case, I changed it to 4. Okay, so we're very close to being finished. What we want to affect now are these offset matrix nodes. So if we check these location, rotation, scales are all set to 0, which is what we want. But we want to make the animation more interesting. And a good way of doing that is simply changing the rotation. In this case, 60 degrees. And for the other one, it's the opposite, -60 degrees. Let's play that. Now that is effectively the node setup. But importantly, we can't move these objects. They are locked into being at the world center. So how do we implement a node system that helps us move these objects so that an animator can place them anywhere in the scene and manipulate them as they need to? Well, for that, we need another empty. Choose arrows. Let's go to item and we'll scale that up. And we'll rename that empty parent. And again, we need to tell the node system that this exists and it needs to respond to the location of this. And to do that, we need another node called object transforms input. So Shift A, object transforms input. We need to select the arrow from the list. We need another node for a matrix transform. Shift A, matrix transform. We need to add this node in between object matrix output. Shift D. Another node. Matrix compose. Location, rotation, scale. Link these. So now this node is referencing the information about this empty, its location, and scale. It knows that it's being used to change the matrix position in space. And we need to connect matrix node output to the transform input. Okay, so what has happened here is that I scaled that empty to 4 times. What I should have done is Control A and applied that scale. Now everything's back to normal. And as you can see, even while this is playing now, I can move that empty and the animation will continue. Well, that's the node setup. I hope this was helpful. I hope I was clear enough. I'm no expert by any means, but this was a great first step for me personally to get into animation nodes, and I think it shows how important a node's workflow can be. So this project file can be downloaded. The link will be in the description. My name is Martin Staley. Thanks for watching.